Take a quick moment and think about what your top flies are right now. If you could only have 5 flies to use on the water tomorrow, what would they be? Today's guest has his top flies, which come from direct communication with some of the best fly anglers from around the world. And today, you're going to get the backstory on these flies, how to fish them, and some tips and tricks so we can improve your game on the water this year. This is the Wet Fly Swing podcast, where I show you the best places to travel to for fly fishing, how to find the best resources and tools to prepare for that big trip, and what you can do to give back to the fish species we all love. Hey, I'm Dave, host of the Wet Fly Swing podcast. I've been fly fishing since I was a kid, grew up around a fly shop, and have created one of the largest fly fishing podcasts out there. I've also interviewed more of the greatest fly anglers and fly tyers than just about anyone in the world. Tim Camisa, fly fishing show celebrity, author, and a go-to guy for inspiration, is here to shed some light on his new book on Euro nymph patterns. And it's not just Euro nymphs today. We're going to get into it all. You're going to find out how to fish a super light nymph in the wind. You're going to find out how to select the best pheasant tail material and what that variation looks like for Tim. And also what this CDC blob fly is all about. We're going to find out about this fly. We got, like we said, 5 of the best in the world. Plus, you will find out why you want your dry fly to act like a soggy diaper in the water when fishing a dry dropper. We're going to talk about that as well. We're going to talk dry flies, and I think we got a couple flies here that are going to really surprise you. So let Tim take it away and explain the behind the scenes. Here we go. Tim Camisa from troutandfeather.com. How's it going, Tim?
Dave, it is wonderful to be back. How's everything going on your end?
It's going good, man. It's always good to talk to you. I think we're up to 3 or 4 episodes now, which is great. I think the more chat with you, like I always say, you've always got a big smile on your face, and I love smiles and all that. So how's the year been going for you?
Oh my gosh. I mean, I know we are recording this in early 2025, so the year is like just off to the start. But I mean, 2024 was a wonderful year, great year for fishing, lots of stuff, in the fly fishing world. I mean, yes, it was really good.
Yeah, great. Well, yeah, as you speak, it's January now. This episode will probably come out in about a month. It'll be February, but you'll be right in the middle of show season, which is, I know you're always a big celebrity, right? I love it how Ben, since his dad, and it's always the celebrities. I love it. I mean, do you feel out there, do you feel like a celebrity?
No, I mean, I'm still like, whenever I walk around these shows, and I think you're referencing, like in 2025, I'll be, headlining and a featured presenter at the fly fishing show in Denver, in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, over in Edison, New Jersey, and I'll be headlining the Midwest Fly Fishing Expo. And Dave, I mean, I know I've said this so many times, but anytime I'm at these shows, I still feel like I'm a little kid, because I used to go to the shows whenever, I was an early teen, whenever I was 10, 11 years old. So I seriously will just be walking past a sign and see my name on the sign and want to pinch myself to be like, I remember 30 years ago when I was that kid walking up to that sign, reading it, saying whose presentation do I want to go see? Who's going to give me all the secret flies or how to catch all the fish? And now to see my name on the other side, it definitely is a very humbling sight every time I see it.
That is really cool. And I've seen out there on just following you on social a little bit, you've been connecting with, you got some good stuff out there, some great name, and maybe talk about that. Who are some of the guys you've been connecting with over the last couple of years, some big names that we should know about?
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess to kind of tell your audience a little bit about where I've come from. I mean, I've been invested in fly fishing for about 35 years, but a little bit over a decade ago or somewhere in that time frame, I started a YouTube channel. And it just started with, I originally was doing a lot of fly tying, presentations. I was tying a lot of patterns. And then it kind of took off to the point where I was giving a lot of my fly fishing presentations online and just kind of, filling in with a lot of niche videos that may relate to European nymphing or dry flies. And then somewhere along the way, I realized, going back to that little kid in me, I grew up just looking up to some of these legends of fly fishing. I mean, we're talking about the Lefty Krays, the Dave Whitlocks, the Joe Humphreys. And now here I am in a position, I'm going to these fly fishing shows and I'm fishing around the country and around the world. And I'm fishing with these people, the people that I look up to. And I said to myself, here I am in this prime opportunity. Sure, I can make, YouTube videos and promote my social media on, little things like dry flies and, the best streamer flies. And that stuff is wonderful, but why not just dedicate some time to interviewing some of these legends of fly fishing? So I come up with a list every year and I say to myself, I plan on interviewing, 3 to 5 of these people in the next year. I make it a point to get out there. And we're talking about people like Tom Rosenbauer of Orvis, people like Joe Humphreys. Recently, I interviewed Tom Baltz. He's a really famous angler from central Pennsylvania that, has been guiding for 50 years. I mean, the guy is just an absolute legend. He's developed fly patterns that are just known around the country. So, I'm really just trying to take some of that time and really give back to fly fishing and just to make sure that we know that these are the legends that came before us. Let's kind of, look up to them a little bit longer.
Yeah, that's great. No, I love that. Well, good. Well, I think tonight we're going to bounce around a little bit here, and I want to get caught up on things. But you have a new book out, and I want to start there because I think this book I just got off. I was just telling the story recent episode, Gilbert Roll, and I'm not sure if he's in the book because I haven't read the whole thing, but we just did an episode with Gilbert last year, and it was one of our most listened to episodes of the year. And, and not just because of Euro nymphing or comp, but I mean, I think that there's something there, right? I don't know what it is about the European nymphing, all that stuff, but you wrote a book basically focusing on the flies. Talk about that. How does this book come to be? Why do you focus on this and not any of the other topics you could have touched on?
Oh, that's a great question. I mean, well, let's start with the notion of, European nymphing. I mean, it has definitely, it was one of those topics that when people first started hearing about it, whenever I say people, I'm talking about, mainly anglers in the United States, it was kind of this underground thing where you heard about this new style fishing and you were dredging these Czech nymphs and they were really heavy, but whenever you would fish them, you would just catch fish like you were using a vacuum cleaner. It was one of these deals, and it was all kind of secretive because most of the information was coming out of Europe. It was still written in Europe. There weren't a lot of videos at the time, and it was kind of that unknown where we were just kind of grasping at straws and trying to figure out how to put a system together. Then some of the key players, at least from my perspective, people like George Daniel, who wrote just an enormous book about this and really just kind of broke the ice and kind of put himself out there as this is a person who's willing to share information and not just hoard it to himself. And then, one of my mentors, Devin Olson, he was still is a member of Fly Fishing Team USA. And, he put out blogs and videos and started a website and just was on podcasts talking about it. And somewhere in between George and Devin, I heard about it. I got invested to it. I started fly fishing more with a friend of mine whose name is Josh Miller from my area of Pennsylvania. And I just went down that rabbit hole and just like, it was advertised, you catch a heck of a lot more fish. I mean, I remember I came home from fishing one day and I remember telling my wife, like, hey, I caught this many fish at this spot and this many fish here. And she was looking at me, Dave, and she was like, are you lying to me? And
You're lying.
She's like, is this a fishing story? I'm like, what are you talking about? She's like, you're telling me like 3 times as many fish from last year. And I'm like, Heather, I'm not lying. It's Euro nymphing.
Yeah.
So that was kind of like my introduction to the topic, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. No, and I love you mentioned Josh Miller because we've been chatting with him. We're going to have him on the podcast soon. And he's a huge reason why I think the youth team and Team USA has won. I think last year they swept the whole podium. And I feel like I've heard that he's just the man. I mean, so Josh, you guys have a lot of history out there, right? Pennsylvania, that east part of the country is a mecca for all this.
For sure. Yeah, I mean, I'm lucky to be out in this area. And, Josh is a good friend of mine. And he worked at a local fly shop. And we kind of connected because we were both, in this Pittsburgh area, though, he definitely was starting to make a name for himself in competitions. And I was making a name for myself on YouTube and, content areas. And so, we had a natural connection to each other. We're really good friends now. Our families hang out. So, I went fishing with Josh. I think we were on our way to a show, maybe the International Fly Tying Symposium. And we stop on this river and, we decide we're going to fish for a couple hours on our way out there. And I remember I'm leading, I'm going first, up this river and I'm catching some fish here and there. And Josh is just smoking these fish. We're talking like one after another. And I'm watching him thinking, what the heck is he doing? And, eventually I say to him, hey, what fly are you using? And he was using like a Frenchie. I'm like, well, I got a Frenchie on too. And I'm like, well, how many split shot? And he's like, well, I'm not using a split shot. I'm like, all right. And I make a few more casts and I'm like, all right, give me your rig. Like, I'm not playing this game. Give me your rod, for friends, let me cast it. And I made this cast and it was like casting a piece of spaghetti. I mean, this thing just felt like it was all over the place. And, that was the beginning of the addiction of Euro nymphing. And, I fell in love with it. It was a challenge. There's a learning curve to it like there are in so many things, fly fishing and fly tying. But it just seemed like it wasn't just about nymphing. You could also fish dry flies. You could fish streamers. You don't have to just be fishing for trout or char. I mean, I've caught salmon using a Euro nymphing rig. I've caught smallmouth bass using a Euro nymphing rig. So, there's lots of different things that you can do with that system.
Yeah.
Now, I know you had asked me about the book, and I guess somewhere, after my first book had come out, it was called Fly Tying for Everyone, which, just blew me away that I'd been asked to write a book. And I was like, it was a really fun experience. I enjoyed it. It was an awesome project. And I was like, I think I can write another book, but you got to find that right topic. And somewhere in there, I found out Josh was writing a book on Euro nymphing. And I'm like, oh, this is like awesome. It's going to be a killer book, which it is. And as he's writing it, he contacted me to tie some of the flies for the book. And I said to him, are you focusing on the flies, or is it really just, tips, tactics, and techniques? And he's like, yeah, it's just the latter.
Yeah.
And I was like, all right, cool. So I kind of planted this seed, and I reached out to my publisher, and I was like, hey, I know where you are right now, in the world of Euro nymphing. I don't think anyone's done a book dedicated to the flies, and I think it'd be a really great thing. So I had a call scheduled, Dave. I felt like, I had this all lined up. I called Jay Nichols. I'm like, hey, here's my idea. And I was waiting for him to just say, yeah, Tim, you just hit it out of the park. And he was like, Tim, that's a terrible idea. Like, I could have Devin write this book.
Right.
I could have Josh. I could have Lance. I could have George. He's naming the names. And I'm like, and then, as he goes on, he's like, but the problem is, George might use George's flies, and, Devin might just talk about Devin's flies. And he's saying this, and though I'm thinking, these are professionals. They're not. They would do a great job. But as he's kind of going through this, he starts to say to me, but Tim, what I need is somebody to kind of treat this book almost like they're an editor, where it's still their book, but they have to go out, they have to interview these people, pull the information, and put it all together. And you're the only person that can do this. And I'm like, oh my gosh, like, we started off this phone call where, like, I'm the worst person to write this book, and now I'm the only person in fly fishing that could do it. So he's like, all right, just get started. I'll send you some contracts. Let me know what you need. And it was literally just like that. I was like off and running. So that was kind of the premise to the book, where I reach out to some of the top anglers and top fly tiers around the world and scheduled interviews and emails, and just pick their brains about not just flies, because it started off as a book about flies, but you can't talk to like the top 5 anglers in the world and just expect it to be about flies. I mean, it was leaders and rods and reels and just so many other areas of fly fishing that we'll get into.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So the book is, and we can talk about that a little more in depth, but that's the cool thing when I think about the Euro nymphs and just the whole thing, is that it doesn't have to be, you don't even have to be Euro nymphing, right? You can use these flies for other situations. Is that the case? Do you find that people are using Euro nymphs for all sorts of different things with a typical 9-foot, rods and all that stuff?
Yeah, exactly. I think you really hit the nail on the head. And, one of the people that wrote a little section for the book is Tom Rosenbauer of Orvis. And I really love to stress Tom's section, because he talks about it. He's like, what is a Euro nymph? I don't even know what defines a Euro nymph. Is it just something really skinny that sinks to the bottom and, it's tied in the round? Like, and what if I don't fish it on, my Euro nymph rig? Does that mean I'm out of the cool kids club? And so he did a really nice job of kind of teasing out, what is a Euro nymph exactly? And do you have to fish it this way, or else you're not fishing it right? And the answer is no. These are, the flies that I have in this book, I really made it a point to say, like, these aren't just, I don't want to say Euro nymphs. They're not just Euro nymphs. They're not just competition flies. I'm not a competition angler. Like, that's not my area of expertise. The flies that I selected for this book are like, 15 flies and 15 variations. And these are like 30 of the best flies being used today. A lot of them just happen to be used by some of the top anglers today who fish competitions too.
Yeah, that makes sense. And maybe describe that a little bit. What did Tom say, or what do you think? What is the definition of a Euro nymph? What makes it a Euro nymph?
Oh, gosh. I don't know if there is one definition, and I think I'd get in trouble really trying to narrow it or niche it down. I've heard a couple people talk about, let's go to European nymphing, because I think years ago it was really difficult for people to define it, because you had all these different European teams and they all had their own little style. You had the French team using long leaders. You had the Czechs using really heavy flies. And if people said, are you Czech nymphing? Are you French nymphing? Are you Spanish nymphing? That all meant something different. And it seems like over the last, especially 3 or 4 years, there's been this race to fish, as light of a leader as possible. And that tends to be what we define as European nymphing now, where it's just really light lines, light hooks, very sensitive rods, and you can really detect a lot of different strikes. That's not the only style of Euro nymphing, but that seems to be kind of the direction that everything's heading, that we can kind of cap everything under. So whenever I say to myself, all right, what are the flies that are being used in that situation? I mean, we're talking about, anglers like Howard Croston. He's a national champion from the UK. Anglers like Lubos Rosa. He's a champion from the Czech Republic. We have an angler in the United States like Devin Olson. I mean, these are people that I interviewed for the book, and these are people who are fishing competitions still to this day. So you have these champions and all these medal winners, and these aren't people that are going to sit down and say, all right, I got, 3 hours to tie some flies. I'm going to take my time and tie a half a dozen. I mean, they have to be cranking these patterns out. So to me, we're looking at a pattern that's got to be tied in a really short amount of time, use few materials. It's going to be something that's not going to be so dialed in that it's going to be very specific for a hatch or as a certain bug. It's going to be something that fish can take as a generalistic style of pattern. The majority of nymphs in the book tend to be tied relatively slender with few appendages, just so they sink a little bit faster. And I guess, when I look at this, these are just general, fish catching patterns. That's how I'm going to help to define all this stuff.
Right. Yeah, they're just good patterns. I mean, they might be Euro nymphs, but they're just all around. You're going to find them in probably most people's boxes. Or would you say most of them are people would know the names of most of these 15 flies?
Yeah, I mean, yes and no. I think there's a lot of different patterns out there that are being used today. And I tried my best to say, all right, if I was going to really try to look at this as, let's take a snapshot in time right now. And this is 2025. If we say to ourselves, what's being used right now in 2025? I think I did a pretty good job of selecting those patterns. I also got kind of lucky at the beginning because, I said to myself, I'm going to be tying, these 15 patterns. And for every 15 pattern, there's also a variation. So I have 15 patterns, 15 variations. So you got 30 patterns that are just given in their entirety in the book. You have all this, high res macro photography for those main 15, which, by the way, they're not just all nymphs. I have it broken down into nymphs. I have a section on paradagons. I have a section on junk flies. I have a section on streamers, and I have a section on dry flies. So it's called tying Euro nymphs, but it's really a well-rounded selection. But then at some point I had asked, I think it was Devin Olson, halfway through our interview, I said to him, hey, if you could just carry 5 flies, it doesn't matter where you're fishing in the world. Let's just say you're on a river, medium gradient with, trout or char. What are your 5 go-to patterns going to be? And Devin just, rattled them off. So I just kind of tucked that information away. And I added that question to my notes. And I got to the next angler, asked that person that question, got those 5 flies. And then, by the end of this, I started to realize, I have 30 confidence lists for 30 of the best anglers around the world. I better take a look at these lists and see to myself, is there, some commonality right, amongst, from Devin to Lance to Pat Weiss, which, by the way, there were very few flies that were on every single list. There was a little bit of overlap, but looking at those lists, it caused me to kind of rethink my own and say, all right, well, here was my original 15. I'm cutting these 5 and I'm going to add these 5 in instead. And that's kind of how my selection process came to be.
Gotcha. That's interesting because, you would think that, maybe the Frenchie or whatever the top 5 you would think, but it sounds like a good mix of flies, from all these guys. And how did you go into that? It must be a tough thing too. You mentioned a few names, but there's more than just 15 people out there that probably could have made the book, right? How did you end up choosing these people? and who's mad at you now, right?
I mean, no one's reached out to me saying they're mad. I haven't seen if anyone's unfollowed me on social media. Yeah, I mean, to select the people, I started off with Devin Olson. He was the first, just because he and I, we've made some videos together for YouTube. We've connected at some of the shows, and we have a very good relationship. We text, we call. He's somebody, I'll be out in the river Euro nymphing and run into a problem, and I'll text him and say, hey, here's what's going on. What do you think's happening? And he'll tell me. He's like, oh, here's what you're doing. Nice. And I'm like, how does he know this? He's really good. So, I started with Devin, and at the end of that phone call, kind of like you would with the podcast, I said to him, hey, who else do I need to be talking to? Right. And he might rattle off 4 names, and maybe I had 3 of them written down, but I didn't have that 4th, so I added them to the list. Or it was somebody I'd never heard of. I think one of the questions I asked somebody was, who's someone that I've never heard of that's just, out there and is somebody that we need to know for the future? And then somebody else's name would come up. And, then I would just say the obvious, hey, can you connect me? Can you share an email address or, give them a call for me just so to see if they're even interested in doing it. And I think every single person I asked, for my first round of people, they all said yes. For the second round of people, they all said yes. I think there were only 2 or 3 people that said no. One of them, they're a European angler. I won't say their name. There's somebody there that always finishes in the top 5. And I just think that they're just so ultra competitive. They just thought maybe they would say something that would slip and they would lose their standing. I mean, when you get to the top 3 or 4 people, there's a reason those names are repeated pretty frequently.
Let On DeMark Lodge give you the Montana fly fishing experience you deserve. The gin-clear waters of the Missouri River offer a world-class experience with one of the finest rainbow trout and brown trout fisheries in the world. Whether you're a seasoned angler or new to the sport, their family of guides will tailor a trip just for you. You can head over to ondemarklodge.com to fish one of the great trout streams in the country. Since 1972, 4-Wheel Campers has been building tough, lightweight campers designed to fit almost any truck. Whether you're after something minimal like me with the Project M or looking for a fully equipped camper ready for your next off-grid adventure, 4-Wheel Campers has a solution for every outdoor enthusiast. You can head over to 4wheelcampers.com right now and use the builder tool to see which topper, slide-in, or flatbed is ideal for you. So let's start there. So tell us, if you can, and we're not going to talk about all the flies, but can you give us 5 maybe out of this book we can talk about, or 4 or 5, something that we could say, these are flies that every one of us right now listening should have these in our box?
Yeah, well, listen, I'm opening the book right now. Let's see, 1, 2, 3. That's perfect, Dave, because I have 5, I have a bunch of chapters, but I have 5 that are on my main headings of flies.
Okay.
And I'll pick one from each of those headings. How about the first one would be a Paratagon?
Yep.
That's without a doubt. I mean, Paratagons are really exceptional patterns. Just to give a little background on it, it's a Spanish fly. I believe Paratagon stands for pellet because it sinks like a rock. I mean, they just get to the bottom in a hurry. My original experience with a Paratagon was, it's something tied with a relatively straight tail, maybe Coque de Leon, a flashy body, a hot spot behind a bead, maybe a slotted tungsten bead on a jig hook. And, it was meant to fish in really fast water. When I first started fishing with them, anytime I would come to a relatively, high gradient section of a river, that would be a fly that I would tie on just to get to the bottom in a hurry because there's just nothing sticking out, nothing to slow its descent through the water. What I whenever I first said to myself, when am I going to be using these on a regular basis? I said to myself, and I kind of put myself in this box, it's only going to be in a section where it's really, really fast water, because that's what I knew about them. And in fact, in my first book, my publisher said to me, hey, you can use any flies you want in that first book. And in fact, I'm pretty sure I'm the first book to ever feature the mop fly. That was in Fly Tying for Everyone, because I'm like, I don't think anyone has featured it. I'll be the first person, whether that's good or bad. But my publisher did say out of every pattern out there, he wanted a Paratagon in that first book. And I said to myself at first, I wonder why he's stressing that so much. And now I realize why. I mean, nearly every one of these anglers, not all, but nearly every one of them said that a Paratagon really belongs, easily in the top 5 of almost every list, or for sure a top 10, just because of its ability to get down. What I learned from my new book is that a lot of these anglers are fishing really small Paratagons. Like I would say to myself, 16s, 18s, maybe 20s. But most of the anglers that I talked about, again, a lot of these competitive anglers, they were fishing 18s, 20s, and 22s. Really small Paratagons because they could put a larger bead on a size 22 jig or a down eye nymph hook, and that thing just sinks to the bottom in a hurry. I feature a few different Paratagons and a few different variations. I'd say probably the most interesting one is one that's called a Gasolina. And a Gasolina, it's a really cool looking pattern. And I'd heard about it from a fly tying perspective because it features this material for the body. And I guess the closest material that we have to it in the United States is called Hen's 233. You can have it as a crystal flash or a little tinsel. So this Gasolina, it has this crazy color, Dave. It almost looks like an oil slick. That's why they call it a Gasolina. So whenever it's wet, it just takes on a bunch of different colors. So it just looks like a lot of stuff. It's a flashy Paratagon. I interviewed David Arquet. He's the creator of this. He's from Europe. In fact, he sells what you would consider to be the original Gasolina material. And he sells it in multiple shades, which I kind of found interesting because, in the United States, we mainly just fish Hen's 233, and that's the Gasolina. Yet you talk to David, he's like, oh, I got a bunch of different shades of this. So there's a light version, a medium version, and a dark version. But to me, kind of the standing thing with this Gasolina is, these people are fishing it in very small sizes, but they're also pairing this Gasolina and they're pairing these small Paratagons with larger nymphs, something like a mop fly. And they're putting the mop fly on the point, they're putting this little paragon as a dropper, and they're just letting that mop or that egg just kind of slither along the bottom and just really slow down that paragon. So these fish are seeing something really small in the water column and just coming up and attacking it.
Wow, that's awesome. Yeah, and the Gasolina it's kind of got a flashy, does it have kind of like a flashy body? Is that what it is?
Yeah, imagine like a body with just crystal flash. That's really what it is, but it has all these different hues to it. And for these paragons, you cover all of them in a UV resin, so they take on this sheen anyway. But you have this sheen that's kind of over this green and I don't know, blues and browns. There's all these different shades depending on how you look at it. Now, let's be honest. If a fish is chasing down a size 20 paragon, are they going to see all those shades? Like, I don't think so. But at least whenever I look at it in my box, it gives me confidence to say, all right, this thing looks pretty cool. I'm going to get some fish on it.
That's it. That is awesome. Yeah, and then the Paragon is more of what's the body material on the Paragon typically?
Paragon, from at least my interviews with these anglers, there were two main body materials that they looked at. One of them, a lot of anglers said, hey, we want something really flashy. So think about crystal flash or a tinsel. That would be one body material. And then another body material that I feature in the book is using thread. So saying to yourself, all right, I'm going to use this, light olive color thread, knowing that whenever it gets wet, it's going to darken a little bit. So, that would kind of be the direction I would point your listeners. If you're going to tie some paragons, have some flashy ones and have some more muted or dull ones tied thread body.
Perfect. And when do just from what you've learned, when does the flashier, do you kind of use the flashier versus the more dull type flies? When would you use one over the other?
Oh gosh, I'd love to tell you that if it's a cloudy day, sometimes dark day, dark fly, bright day, bright fly, I'll at least lean down that setting, but I don't look at it like that. It's kind of like one of those things where, first of all, if I'm coming to some fast water, a paragon might be one of my first flies simply because it gets down in a hurry. But I guess to tell another story, Dave, I remember I was fishing with my wife. We were fishing on this beautiful little stream in central Pennsylvania, and we're out there and we're on this really slow section, just slow moving water where there's some caddis on the water. And at one point, my son and my daughter were out with us, and I was showing my son how to pick apart, a caddis case, and we dug out the larva, and I took a picture of it in his hand. It was this really bright green caddis larva. It was a granum caddis. So a little bit later, he was telling my wife about it, and I said, let's show mom the picture, and we showed her the picture, and just kind of moved on from that. And about 15 minutes after that, she hooked a really nice brown trout. This was just big, wild brown trout. So, she's fighting it. She's been, fly fishing for a number of years. She did a great job with this fish, and she lands it. And, as it slides into the net, the first thing I'm thinking is what fly did she use? And I look in the fish's mouth, and it's a paragon. I'm like, well, that was a dumb idea. Why would you fish a paragon in slow moving water? And she's like, well, it had this green body. I saw that green fly. I figured that'd be a good idea. And I'm like, Heather, you don't use paragons in slow moving water. And now fast forward to this book, I'm having an interview with Pat Weiss, this, an incredible angler from central Pennsylvania. And he's telling me all about his paragons. And I'm like, so Pat, you just fish these in fast water, right? And he's like, absolutely not. Slow water paragons slay. And I'm like, oh my gosh, my wife definitely had me beat there.
Nice. That is so good. Yeah, that's awesome. You got the kids too, right? Are the kids into, you have two kids, right?
Yeah. I have a son who just turned 9 and my daughter's 4. And listen, all of our vacations, all of our trips were built around fishing. Yeah. So those kids, they have to come, no matter what. I mean, they have waders, rods. Sometimes my son, he prefers to throw a spinning rod over a fly rod. This year, he really wants to throw a fly rod again. So they just go back and forth. We had them steelhead fishing a few weeks ago on one of the tributaries of Lake Erie, and
cool.
My son landed a couple fish. He loved it. And my daughter, for some reason, she didn't want to catch one because they were just so big, and she was afraid she was going to get pulled in. But eventually, I hooked one, handed her the rod, and she did a great job with it.
Amazing. That's so good. Nice. Well, this is great. Well, and talk about this a little bit. Let's just stick with the Paragon for a little bit. How is it, in the book, maybe you could break down just overall so people know what to expect. Are you breaking down, talk about how you break down that book. Do you have kind of some conversations with people that tied this fly? Talk about that. How is each chapter broke down?
Oh, gosh. I guess let me take a step back. So whenever I was writing this book, imagine hey, every morning, I'm waking up around 5 o'clock and I'm writing X amount of words for the book. So I'm creating a skeleton of the book. I had an idea of my sections. I had an idea of the flies, but I'm like, I have to, get some words down on in my laptop. And then aside from that, I'm scheduling these, 1 to 2 hour Zoom interviews. I'm sending out emails with questionnaires to these, 30 some anglers and tyers. And at some point, those two have to mesh. And, once I had the flies finalized, I said, all right, these are the flies. I'm going to do a step-by-step of pictures. I decided, how I was going to do that. So, macro photography came out for all of that. And then the trickiest part of this whole project was saying to myself, I have all these interviews that I typed up. I probably should have used AI, but I said to myself, I'm just going to re-listen to every single interview just so I can make sure, I have it written down the right way. Just because, just like with the podcast, it's one thing whenever you're in the moment, but it's another thing when you're kind of watching as an observer.
Yep.
So I went through and I categorized them. So say, for instance, I was talking with Lance Egan about bead colors, which bead color to use on which type of a day. I wanted to be able to say, all right, Lance said you use silver on this day, copper and gold on this day. And I would put those into section under beads. And then, I would have another section on thread color, and I'd have a section on, pheasant tails. And anytime, somebody said something about a new topic, I would, write that section down in that heading. So it kind of at the end, the final component was saying to myself, all right, how do I integrate all of their quotes with my writing and finding, just that right, I don't want to say jigsaw, but that's really what it was, because every morning as I'm also writing that skeleton, I'm thinking about the previous interview and about what they said and all the other ones. So I was able to still kind of build around all of their thoughts and ideas, but then back it up with their actual quotes throughout. So whenever you look at a section like the Gasolina, like let's just say to ourselves, we're going to first see a really beautiful picture of that fly, something like I call it one of my mirror shots. So I have a reflection picture of the fly with the recipe. Then there's going to be a few paragraphs about the Gasolina. Just to give a little bit of history, there's going to be some quotes from the individual that developed that fly or created the fly. There's going to be, anywhere from 15 to 20, pictures of it. Each picture is going to have a description of what's going on as you go through the tying procedures. You're also going to have a section on something that I might call like fly tying tips. So there's a section that we'll talk about, like, here's something that maybe I did and I really want to just tease that out a little bit and go into more detail as to this fly tying technique for it. Then one of the most important ones is, fishing suggestions. So I talk about how would you fish this fly. And that's where I pulled in a lot of quotes from those anglers to say, all right, if I'm fishing with a Paragon, here's what I'm going to do. I mean, for the Paragon, for instance, one of the best fishing ideas came from Devin Olson for that one. And I remember Devin saying, he really values Paragons, but it's tough to fish a Paragon on a windy day because they do sink to the bottom in a hurry. But if the wind is blowing on your leader, it can lift that fly right back up. So he's like, you have to say to yourself, how can you get it down there and keep it down there? And he paired it with the mop fly because he's like, hey, those mop flies, they sink like a parachute. They take forever to get to the bottom. But then let's use that thinking and say, all right, once they're there, it's going to take that much more to lift them up.
All right.
So let's fish a mop fly on a windy day, then, pair it with something small like that Paragon. And, that's kind of one of his go-to rigs in the wind. So, getting that type of information and then finding its home in the book, that was the tricky part. That's where it really caused me to do a lot of thinking.
Finding like where that's really interesting. I remember when, I asked John Gierach, RID, and he is on the podcast, and I was asking him about his process in writing books. Obviously John Gierach, and he said a similar thing. It was like, you don't want your book to be like you're watching your uncle's slideshow from Hawaii vacation, right? Where it's like, here's the start, then here's the finish. It sounds like is that part of the beauty of writing books? You kind of find that mix where it's not about start to end. It's just you find your own mix.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Dave, I don't think I've told this to anybody. I wrote the introduction to this book 3 times. I wrote it 3 separate times, not realizing I had written it those other times. And at the very end, whenever I went to put all my sections together, I'm like, oh my gosh, I wrote my intro 3 times and it was written 3 different ways. One of the 3 I did not like. It may have been my first one. I was like, all right, that one's trash. But I'm looking at these next 2 and I'm like, oh my gosh, these are both really good. When you're kind of taking a step back, I'm like, I did a nice job with these intros. And it was like, which one am I going to pick? And that's kind of one of the struggles of being a writer is that, once you start getting that stuff down and you do have to remove some of that, it's like, you're throwing a piece of you away in a sense. So no, John, he's definitely at another level from any of us, or at least from me.
Right. Well, this is good. So we started off with the Paragon. Let's keep this rolling here. What would be a second pattern you'd say if we had to have 4 or 5 patterns in our box? Everybody should have these. What's the number 2?
Oh gosh, I think I'll go with an easy one. I don't want to take the easy way out, but my second section is considered nymphs with dubbing and soft tackle.
Oh,
So if we
nice.
say to ourselves, Paradigons sink fast, now let's start building some stuff. So maybe like a thorax that's a dub thorax, or something with a little bit of CDC for the hackle. And I don't know, I have 4 or 5 of like my top flies of all time in that section. So it's really tricky, but I think the pattern that I'll kind of point to is going to be a pheasant tail. And the reason I say that is because, out of all those confidence flies, there was really one fly that kind of just has stood the test of time that nearly every angler said, this is one of my go-tos. In fact, Gregory Juglaret, he's a French angler. Whenever I asked him about his 5, he kind of laughed. And he's like, Tim, there's only one. It's the pheasant tail.
Right.
Like, that's it. Like, this is a top 3 angler in the world, and he's fishing like one fly the majority of the time.
Wow. One of the oldest, right? Like, but what the history probably a little bit. One of the oldest flies that's out there, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's a Frank Sawyer
Yeah, Frank
creation.
Sawyer.
It was originally tied with just wire and pheasant tail. I mean, it was a nothing fly. I mean, he developed this, I believe, for chalk streams over in England. So, kind of knowing that it has that history, it's a basic fly that could just represent so many different, forms of food for fish. Just knowing that, like, it's out there. Now, I did say to myself, I can't just tie like the typical pheasant tail because, and I'll point back to something that my publisher told me in my first book. He was like, Tim, I don't want you to have the parachute Adams in your book. Like, it's been done. It's in many books. You can find it everywhere. Like, there's no reason to try to recreate the wheel. So I said to myself, like, I have to have versions of the pheasant tail in this book. And of course, I'm going to talk about the main version. But can I also just kind of highlight a new one that maybe not everyone knows about? And the pattern that I share is this pattern called the simple pheasant tail. And this is a pattern that was developed from Pat Weiss, the Central Pennsylvania angler. And Pat is somebody that your listeners probably don't know too much about. Now, if they follow Fooling Mill at all on social media, Fooling Mills mentions his name quite frequently because they carry a ton of his patterns. He's just got a bunch of flies that catch fish. He's one of these competition anglers that, as I like to say about him, if he's in a room with other comp anglers and he starts talking, everyone gets quiet because they want to know what he has to say. He's just one of those people that he's going to catch fish wherever he goes. He's a hunter. He's going to be successful whenever he's in the woods. He's just that guy. So there's a couple flies that he's kind of really known for, especially in the Pennsylvania area. But the one that, I gravitated to, this simple pheasant tail, it's tied with like one material. It's just tied with pheasant tail. But the tricky part is it's a bleached ginger pheasant tail. And it kind of threw me off because, Pat's a really secretive dude. He's one of those guys that, like, you'll ask him a question and he won't lie to you. He just won't tell you everything. And you kind of got to put the rest together. So, sure enough, like, I was talking to him about this fly and he gave me a little bit, but I felt like there was more. So I was texting him and he gave me a little bit more. And I'm looking at pictures of this fly and something just wasn't right to me. And it's because, to find a true bleached ginger pheasant tail, it's tough to do. So for anyone out there who gets this book, and I'm sure I say this in the book as well, like, I had ordered bleached ginger pheasant tails from fly shops from around the country. I think I ordered like 6 or 7 sets. And I even went to a couple of local fly shops. And I'm the person that when I go, I will remove every single one from the bin and look them over. And it was really tough to find a true one because what you're looking for whenever you're looking at the back of a pheasant tail, a bleached one, you want the tips of it to be relatively light and it should be darker by the center, darker by that stem. And the reason that Pat looks for them that color, imagine this, like, you're tying in the pheasant tail, the tips is the tail, yep, and it's really bleached and it's lighter by the tail. So as you start winding that forward, it's going to give you a relatively lighter abdomen for the fly. But if the center of that pheasant tail, if it's darker, and as you continue winding it up, it starts to darken as the fly moves forward. So by the time you get to the thorax, it's a dark thorax, kind of like, natural insects out there. So Pat found a way to take one material, a pheasant tail, create something that's different than everyone else's pheasant tail, but also find a way to have it replicate all the natural insects out there. And this is a fly that works for caddis. It works for like mayflies, like the light cahill, like sulfurs. I mean, it's just a fly that will catch fish in a lot of different situations. So I think he originally called it like the stupid, simple pheasant tail. And I think Fooling Mill said, all right, get the word stupid out of it. We're just going to call it the simple pheasant tail. Yeah. And it's stuck. There's no material for the thorax. There's no dubbing or anything like that. There's no CDC. It's just like, I don't know, pheasant tail wire, and red thread. And that's really it.
It's pheasant tail. I mean, it's literally the original, even simpler than the original, right? The original was pretty simple because it had the only difference, it had the thorax and the peacock, which is one big thing. I always said, I love peacock. I feel like peacock is one of those natural materials that's just amazing, but it just shows you this fly works just as effective, it sounds like, without the peacock. And it's amazing. Do you think, I mean, and of course there are flies that are just floss bodies too. So what is it about these flies? What would you tell somebody who isn't a master of the fly or the entomology, the tying? Why do these super simple, is it just about getting down weight? Is that a big part of it?
I don't know. I don't want to say that because I think a lot of these anglers, the more I talk to them about the notion of Euro nymphing, they're not dredging the bottom. They're not really just bouncing these flies along the bottom. A lot of them are fishing them a lot higher up in the water column than people like me originally thought. And so knowing that they're really trying their best to have the fish, take them as they're in the drift. So it's not just about dredging the bottom and doing that. With flies like that, I mean, I'd love to tell you a fish looks at a pheasant tail, and a pheasant tail fiber has all these barbules, all these little fibers on it that should move and should breathe in the water. But again, I don't know if the fish can see that well whenever they're far away. Yeah. To me, I just wonder, does it look like something buggy? Does it look like something they see on a regular basis? Or in that fly's case, does it look like something they don't see on a regular basis and they say, hey, let's try this out? I think, any of us would just be kidding if we think we could figure out exactly why a fish eats. But there is something about that pheasant tail that's just, is it natural? Is it something that just looks like so many of their food sources? I mean, I think you could make an argument that if you have a traditional pheasant tail, you could look at that and say to yourself, that kind of looks like a case for a case caddis. Like they could eat that as a caddis. They could eat that as a mayfly. Like they could eat that as an emerger. I mean, with some of these pheasant tails, if you add just 1 or 2 turns of CDC and you take off the bead, that's like one of my favorite dry flies of all time now. So, there's just so many different things you can do with that pattern that just really seem to attract the fish.
Stay warm, stay focused, and don't let the cold dictate quitting time with Heated Core's advanced base layer technology. Hydro Wick fabric wicks away moisture while undetectable carbon fiber heating elements target key areas to keep you dry and warm all day long. I had a troubling experience fishing a New York steelhead stream while in December. I was fishing it and my feet, my legs, I was getting cold. I literally felt like things were freezing. I had to step out of the water and I literally had to stop fishing. And then I watched somebody else take that steelhead. So never again for me. I'm sticking with Heated Core. Lightweight and unrestricting, you can stay on the water all day with 3 levels of heat and a rechargeable 7.4 lithium-ion battery. Heated Core may just be your ticket to more time on the water this season. Well, I think we got a good start here. Let's keep this rolling. Let's go to number 3. What do you, if you had to say number 3, everybody should have the fly in your box. And again, we're not going deep on all this, but I think it's a taster, give people, wetting their whistle a little bit.
Oh, cool. Let's get on to the next section. So the next section, I call this one slow sinkers. And I kind of looked at this as, all right, what are some patterns that take a little bit longer to get to the bottom? We're talking about flies like the mop. And in this case, I think the one that I'll probably share, gosh, this is a tricky one. Let's go with the notion of fishing a worm. Because I think that was a fly, and I think this will be a good talking point that caused a little bit of a riff in my book. We'll say that. Now let's take a step back. Yeah. Whenever I say a worm, I mean, in the book, I feature a couple different worm patterns.
Yeah. When you say worm to me, I always think, first thing I think of is San Juan worm. That's always like, all right, San Juan worm.
And I have a picture of the original one in my book because, I've been doing this since I was 10. That's 35 years ago. Like that was my first one, Dave. It's like, that was the one. It was like, you had to find that right size chenille. And, I remember I think it was vermeil and you had to, I remember burning the ends with a burner. Sometimes I would slide them through a bead. That was my go-to fly for so many years. And then when the squirmy wormy came out, it kind of exploded onto the fly fishing scene. And I wanted to feature that because there's just something that's, I don't know, the squirmy wormy is just one of those flies that it just catches fish for so many different species. So I said to myself, all right, who's the guy that created the squirmy wormy? His name's David Hayes. I'm going to interview David. So I reached out, had a great interview with him, which was super cool to be able to say, like, my book features the guy that created or invented the squirmy wormy. So that was awesome. So I have a whole section on that, which, by the way, the first one was glow in the dark. You hit it with a UV torch and it glows. And that was the first one that he saw. I think he was in like a craft store or a party store with his kids and he saw that material and he was like, ooh, that'd make a good fly. And he was in line And he was about to check out, and he was like, I think I should go back and get this just in case. And he did. And, everything's changed since.
Yeah.
But then in the competition world, flies like the squirmy wormy, or that fly specifically, it's gotten banned in a lot of competitions.
Oh, wow.
So like now you're talking about like, all right, you have a fly that like people are saying it catches too many fish, which is so crazy to even believe that. But for everyone out there, like know that there are competitions that you're not allowed to fish that fly, where they literally change the regulations just so you can't use a squirmy wormy.
Wow.
So which should tell everyone, if you're not fishing competitions, it works. Like know that, number one. But I also wanted to make sure I was looking at this from a well-rounded perspective. And I'm like, all right, well, the squirmy works, but a lot of these anglers aren't using the squirmy. So what's their go-to fly now? And so many of them were wonderful. And the fly they're using is kind of a chenille version. And there are many different anglers that I talked to. But now let's go back to our original San Juan, Dave. Like that's what we're talking about. Like this micro chenille, stuff that's even finer than the ones that we used. I mean, these were super fine, down to, I can't even remember how small. I think the suede chenille that I used for one of the flies, it's a Semperfli material, and it was 1 millimeter. I mean, it's just a really tiny diameter of stuff. And some of the anglers that I talked to about the worms were people like Noah Shapiro. And Noah's a member of the youth team, because I said to myself, I don't want just like all the adults. Why don't I find some members of the youth team out there and talk to them as well? So I did. So I interviewed a number of the youth team members. And I remember Noah's interview specifically because, he really loved talking about the worm. And, he kept telling me about all these fish. And I was like, well, Noah, tell me, how do you tie this worm? And he got a little sheepish. And he's like, Tim, it's literally like a hook, a bead, and then you jam the material right against the hook, and you tie in like 10 strands of thread, and then that's it. That's the whole fly. And I'm like, no, there's got to be like something to prevent it from fouling. He's like, no, Tim, like that's literally it. This is like 10 terms of thread, maybe a little super glue, and you're done. And I was like, oh my gosh, which, other anglers had other versions of that fly that are also shared. In the worm section, I think I have multiple flies. That's one of the few that has a couple different patterns that I share. But then, after having that interview, I remember talking to a few other anglers, and I realized that a lot of anglers, especially some of the European anglers, they are really opposed to worm fishing. And to them, because it's almost too easy. Oh, wow. And a lot of them said, something along the lines of, if you could have a really poor fishing technique and still catch fish on a worm. And they said that, and as the writer of this book, now I'm rolling into a dilemma. Like, all right, I have like 15 people that say like this is one of their ride or die flies, and I have 15 other anglers that are saying like, if you use this, I'll never talk to you again for the rest of your life. And I'm like, oh shoot, like what do I do here? And as the person writing this book, I thought, listen, again, this is a snapshot of today. Like this is right now. Like I want this to be as accurate as possible. I used everyone's quotes. So for the people that said like, hey, this is not for me, there's a section on, for them that's talking about why they're opposed to the worm. And I think it's important to have that out there to say like, this is why this person who happens to be a top 10 angler doesn't use worms and doesn't think you should either. And here's another section on, people like, Cody Bergdorf from the United States team, or Pablo Castropinos from Spain, and about saying like, here's how you select the right material when you do tie a worm. And so I wanted to have kind of both perspectives in there.
Nice. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And what is I guess on you mentioned one of them, it's too easy, but what would be another objection to using the worm? Is it, other than it's too, is there any other good objections that came up?
I think there was a section on there that I talked a little bit about an interview whenever I talked with Lance Egan, and I wouldn't say that he did not object to the worm. He really loves using worms. I shouldn't say really loves. I don't want to put that word in his mouth.
Yeah, but he's not against them.
No, he's not against them for sure. But he works in a fly shop called Fly Fish Food. I'm sure you know that. Our boys out there. Yep. And Lance is. He was telling me during our interview that he gets a lot of customers that come in, they're opposed to using worms, and he said to them why, and they're like, well, we prefer to match the hatch.
Right.
And he's like, well, let's talk about this. Like, we're not talking about like a garden worm, we're talking about an annelid. And during high water events, the water rushes through through the sides of the bank, and it washes annelids into the water. So you're telling me like you want to match the hatch, like wouldn't you want to, after a high water event, fish these worms to match the hatch?
Exactly. How's that different than fishing a grasshopper, right?
It's not. No, it's not. So, my favorite quote about fly fishing is like, the wonderful thing about fly fishing and tying is we each get to choose our own path. That's the beauty of this. And And again, like when I had that angler that said, don't use it, it's going to ruin your technique versus the other angler that says, use this. You can catch striped bass. You can catch Atlantic salmon. You can catch all these fish on squirmy wormies. You have to pick your own path and say to yourself, what are you trying to get out of this?
Yeah, perfect. No, and just to clarify, the third pattern you're going with here, is it the squirmy or is it the San Juan style?
Gosh, let's just say a worm style. We'll just say a worm fly.
Just go worm. That'll make it better. Yeah, I like that.
Yeah, we'll say worm fly.
I like that we have a worm in here. This is so good. Love it. So
dirty, Dave. This is getting bad.
It's good. So let's go number 4. What do you have here? You got 2 more left to throw to this list. What would you go with your 4th?
All right. Well, we'll start to kind of slide a little bit away from nymphs and junk flies. I had a section on streamers as well because, at one point during these interviews, the notion of high water events definitely came up. And, during high water events, a lot of the anglers would use either darker flies or larger flies. That seemed to be one of the main things. But another fly that people really gravitate to is one that, I'm sure you and I both love, the woolly bugger. And there's just something about a pattern that you look at that just, you say to yourself, what does this represent? It could be, a caterpillar, a bait fish, it could be a hellgrammite, a stonefly. I mean, it could be so many different things, and they catch fish. And, as I was working on this book, there's kind of this buzz going in the fly fishing world about jig streamers. So we have these streamers that are tied on jig hooks, and they're kind of like the poor man's woolly bugger. That's what I'll call them. So a jig bugger. And it's as simple as it sounds. Imagine you have a jig hook around a 3 to 4 millimeter slotted tungsten bead, marabou tail, some type of flashy body like a chenille body, and that's it. No hackle, no, CDC or saddle hackle or anything like that. Just a really, really simple tie. That would be the next fly that I share because, whenever it got down to this, these anglers all really do fish streamers, but they pick their spots when they're fishing them. And they also want to have some streamers that, they can tie in a really short amount of time. So this book does feature, I think, 4 streamers, but out of the 4, that jig bugger is just the simplest one to tie. And it catches fish. I mean, if someone's out there listening and saying, all right, what should I tie? What colors? What sizes? It's like, go the size, 10 or 12, do some, all whites, all blacks, and you are good to go.
Good to go. And how do you typically, is there just a ton of ways to fish that? Or what's your most common way you're fishing that jig bugger?
Ooh, I'm so glad you asked that because, with these streamers, and I want to see if I can turn to the section on that. As I'm going, I'm not going to read the section to everybody out there, but what I realized about these fishing suggestions is that, first of all, you have to figure out what type of water are you fishing in and say to yourself, how heavy of a bead do I want? Because are you going to fish it, dead drift? That would be like the main thing to start. Like maybe we're just going to drift this, do a dead drift and just see what happens. And we have to make sure we don't have too heavy of a bead because if you're on really skinny water, you might be fishing something like a 3 or a 3.5 millimeter versus if you get to really big water, you might bounce it up to like a 5.5 millimeter tungsten bead to really get down to hurry. So we're going to say, all right, what kind of bead size are we going to select? Once we get to that bead size, we got to say to ourselves, all right, let's kind of go through the motion of streamers. Like, let's start with, we're just going to do our dead drift. Then the next time through, maybe we're going to jig it. And by jig it, I mean, we're just going to raise our rod tip, a couple centimeters as it's going down every 3 feet or every 2.5 feet, just to give it a little bit of jigging motion, maybe to have a fish chase and eat. Maybe we're going to strip it back once it swings around and see if we have a fish that chases there. There's another technique that people were talking about. They would cast it out, and as it would start to go down, they would just do a gentle retrieve across the currents. So they would do that as well. And I kind of looked at this as it seemed like every fishing technique that I mentioned was a little bit more intrusive than the previous one. So it's kind of like you start, you say to yourself, which of these techniques is going to disturb the least amount of fish till the end where maybe you're just ripping this fly across the current to really just draw a strike.
Gotcha. Yeah, that makes sense. So it's diverse and you said it. So I love how you started that. The questions they asked. First of all, when you're thinking about like, how are you going to fish? Is that how you go into all your flies when you're creating something? Is you're always thinking like, okay, how am I going to fish this exactly? How's it going to, whether I'm going to be deep water, fast water, kind of wind, all that stuff. How do you what do you factor in when you're tying these flies? It sounds like you're thinking of a lot of things.
Yeah, I mean, for sure. And I guess that would be a major takeaway that I had for a lot of these anglers. And I think for a lot of fly tiers who say to themselves, like, I'm trying to tie a fly to hit not just this one situation, but a number of situations. A lot of these comp anglers, they are very intentional and precise in what they do. And they're very thoughtful and constantly questioning why. Why should I make the tail this size? And let's talk about this fly specifically, this jig bugger. A lot of anglers looked at this fly, and a lot of them fish this fly. This is not a fly that's just like here's a fly that Tim's throwing out there. Like, this is a fly that they're fishing. But one of the struggles that I had was selecting the one that I thought would benefit the readers the most. And the issue that I had was with the length of the tail, because a lot of the anglers said to themselves, like, all right, number one, you want to find quality marabou, which it's not as easy to find quality marabou today as it was 10 or 15 years ago. So, I really reached and I found a lot of different marabous. I bought a ton of different marabous. I think there was one that was called it was a Fulling Mill, maybe Extra Select. That was probably the best marabou that I could find that really made a nice tail, that really had nice fluffy fibers the whole way out to the tips, had a bunch of barbules. Like, that was the best marabou that I could find, at least everyone had access to. You could talk to a few independent people, but that would be the one that people could buy. But then it was like, all right, I got this marabou. It's awesome. I'm going to get a giant clump of it and really just push it all together. So, I have a ton of marabou in there for a ton of movement. But how long do I make the tail?
Yeah.
And you talk to some anglers, and they wanted that tail as long as possible. They wanted it super long, because the longer the tail, the more movement, the more fish were attracted.
Oh, wow. You mean like how long? Like twice the body length, or how
long?
Oh,
more than that. We're talking like 4 times the length.
Oh, wow.
Body. I mean, really crazy, Dave. To the point where people are holding up flies as we're having these interviews on their cameras, and I'm like, there's no way I would fish that. Right. They're like, you have no idea, Tim. But that's how you get the movement. Like, if you're not fishing something articulated, how else can you get movement in a fly like that? Again, like, they're saying to themselves, how can I do this? Why am I going to catch more fish than you? And it's because of that movement. But then I had a couple anglers as well who kind of argued back, and they're like, yeah, you get all this movement, but whenever the fish eat, you get a lot of, short strikes, or they're eating that tail and you're not hooking them. And from a competitive angler perspective, they have to hook that fish, they have to land that fish. And I believe the fly still has to be in their mouth whenever they come over to score it. So they had to get those fish in the net.
Yeah.
So just looking at just like one pattern, there's a lot of thought that goes into this. Just when you're saying, all right, well, we're going to tie in the tail of a woolly bugger, because you don't have to tie this jig bugger, but just if you're like, I'm going to tie in the tail of my woolly bugger, like, yeah, do you just follow a recipe that says tie it, 1 times the shank? But then we're using jig hooks, and some of these are like extra short shanks. So if I say like 3 times the shank, that still may not be that long compared to a traditional woolly bugger. Like, there are so many factors at play with some of these patterns.
Wow, this is cool. Yeah, I think this is the cool thing about this is that people, can grab your book and they know that these patterns have already been vetted, But at the same time, we should all be thinking like, hey, okay, I got this pattern on. You know what? Just because Pat Weiss tied this pattern or whoever it was doesn't mean I can't tweak it a little bit, right, along the way. Do you think that's good advice, that we can even make it, customize it to our own fit along the way?
Oh, without a doubt. And I think when I did with the streamers, I actually have, a couple of these streamers, and like, that was the most basic one. And the next streamer kind of builds upon that fly, and it's another pattern that you kind of add a couple more materials just to kind of do what you're saying, like customize it, maybe add a little bit more movement in behind the bead. So I said to myself, I want to make this book and have patterns that are easy to tie, but also some intermediates that people may not know so much about yet. So I tried my best to kind of build those throughout.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, let's you want to add one more here before we get out of here? A 5th fly of the people are going to have their must-have 5 in their box for everybody listening?
Yes. All right, let's do that. Let's get to the 5th one. I'll kind of follow the order that I'm setting as precedent, and I'll go through my sections.
Yeah.
The last section's on dry flies. And, at first, if you're like, oh, wait, this is a book on nymphs, like, where do dry flies fit in? So many of these anglers, so many of the top anglers, we're talking about people like Pete Erickson, Michael Bradley. I mean, I interviewed some individuals who are on the adult, like what do they call that?
I always get confused too, because it's not like the golf; it's the opposite of the golf.
Yeah, it is kind of like the Masters, though. I think it might be the Masters.
I think it's I think the seniors are the younger. Yeah, the Masters are the older guys.
Yeah, I think that's how it goes. And I could probably look up in the bio section, because I have a bio on all these. But I interviewed like Pete Erickson. He was a gold medalist for the United States, and we'll call it the Masters competition. So. And especially Josh Miller, I'll kind of lean on Josh for this one. A lot of these anglers are fishing dry droppers. And at first, I kind of said to them, all right, tell me a little bit about this, because, most people, if you say, all right, I fish a dry dropper, it's like, well, what does that mean? It's like, well, I'm fishing a big chubby Chernobyl with the hare's ear underneath. And whenever that chubby goes down, I set the hook. And it's like, The precision involved in these dry droppers is just, it just seems light years ahead of where my thinking would have been, because we're talking about fishing a size, I don't know, 16 or size 14 dry fly with maybe a nymph that has a 2 millimeter tungsten bead, and they're fishing this on a leader, a micro thin leader. Maybe the entire leader is 5x, and it goes down to a tippet that could be 6x or 7x. So just saying to yourself, how are they even throwing these things 30 feet, 40 feet, sometimes 50 feet? Like, there's just a lot that goes into that. So they couldn't pick dry flies that were super bushy that are going to have a lot of air resistance. So that's like, right now, you just got to eliminate a lot of flies that you would think, oh, this is something that I would use as a dry fly to support my nymph. But you also want to make sure you're selecting a dry fly where you also have a chance to catch a fish if they're eating on top. Like in some cases, some of the dry flies are just kind of sacrificial. They're out there to maybe keep a nymph in a certain drift or in a certain run. Because if you're trying to Euro nymph and you have a straight line to that fly, there's going to be some sag in your system, and it's going to kind of pull your fly across those currents. So at times, these anglers are selecting dry flies and a dry dropper, which means a dry fly maybe coming off a dropper tag, and then a nymph on the point. And they want that because then they know that dry fly will kind of help to keep that nymph in a certain line. But at times, yeah, sure, it's a sacrificial dry fly, but at other times they're like, all right, we're fishing for maybe brown trout. We know brown trout love to eat dry flies. So we also want to make sure we're throwing a dry fly that has a chance of getting eaten, that the fish are going to say yes to. But then probably the biggest takeaway I have before I share a fly is that whenever you're selecting that dry fly to pair with the nymph, you don't just go with any dry fly. You go with one that's just going to suspend the nymph. I mean, I'm talking about, Dave, imagine like somebody in like a soggy diaper floating down the river, where if you would just like touch their toe, they would go underwater. And that's the dry fly you want to select for this, because the moment anything happens, it could be a fish that's, 6 inches long or 16 inches long. Even if they just touch that little nymph for just a tenth of a second, you want your dry fly to react. And this is the level these anglers are on.
Jeez.
I'm thinking to myself, all right, it's a dry dropper. You're looking for that dry fly to go down. It wasn't always going down. Sometimes these anglers are talking about they saw their dry fly turn 90 degrees during the drift.
Oh,
they
wow.
set the hook. At one point, somebody said, they're like, Tim, imagine whenever you pull down on a volleyball or a beach ball in the water, how the water ripples away.
Oh, yeah.
And they're like, sometimes my dry fly would be floating down and I would see ripples moving away from it. And I set the hook. And sure enough, there was a fish there. The fly wouldn't even show anything. They just saw ripples moving away from it, and that indicated an eat. So, we're talking some of these guys are next level, but it's not that they're next level. It's just, they have the ability to think at that level. But remember, they're also sharing these levels with us. So for all of you listeners out there, if they're thinking, oh my gosh, this sounds so advanced, it's not. Remember my background. I'm an elementary school teacher. I teach sixth graders, and I wrote the book so you can read this. I'm not saying, sixth graders going to understand everything I wrote, but I'm putting all these concepts and these ideas in this book for all of us. This is for us to get better as anglers, not just to get a peek inside this world. I want to be in that world. I think many of us can be fishing at this style, at this pace, at this level. We just have to know what the level is. I think for so many of us, it's we don't even know what we don't know. And now I think this gives us a peek inside that world.
Yeah, it does. It pulls back the curtain a little bit, right, from these top of the game people who have really in their fish. I mean, especially these competition. I mean, these guys are fishing in all sorts of streams all around the world. So there's a good argument to say these guys are kind of the best, right? Because they've fished in every stream. So it makes sense. But no, this is great. So we got, and so your dry fly, so let's go back to that. And I love this soggy diaper, right? Basically what you're saying is, in that analogy, you don't want to have some fluffy giant dry fly that takes a ton of power to pull down. You want to really, the subtlest little thing, smallest, and that's why maybe a lot of these dry flies too, you see some of these things are kind of almost in the surface film, right? Well, what would you call those dry flies that are more down in almost in the surface?
Well, I mean, it depends on the style of the fly. I mean, you could make an argument that if it's in the film, it could be more of an emerger, which could be an insect that's, making its emergence from a nymph or from a larva into an adult. So it could be representative of that. In many cases, these flies, they just happen to be low riders. I mean, it's nothing more than that. They're just, it's a fly that's just kind of being pulled down into the film a little bit. So I wouldn't overthink exactly
Okay.
where it's sitting there.
Gotcha.
Then again, maybe you should. Dave, you're thinking on another level now. I love that.
You can, yeah. I'm taking it up to the next level. So, and then what do you have? And then the fly there. What would be
Yeah,
the dry
sure.
fly? Yeah.
Let's go with somebody. Let's go with Lubos Rosa. Lubos is one of three people I feature from the Czech Republic. One of the individuals I interviewed is Franta Honek. He's the owner of Honek Competition. Franta is a good friend of mine. I think I fly fish in Iceland quite frequently, and I host trips there. And Franta came on my trip this summer to fish for Atlantic salmon and trophy brown trout. We had a great time, and I interviewed Franta about his hooks because the Honek Competition hooks are they tend to be known as the kind of like the Ferraris of the fly tying world for hooks. So I interviewed him, got his confidence flies for this, and one of the really, I don't want to say an up and comer fly tyer because he's an incredible tyer. His name's John. I'm gonna butcher his last name, but it's like Wittmer or Wittman with a W. And I have him. He did a little section on fly tying for me. Shared his confidence flies and sent in a bunch of images to use. He was wonderful. And then the third person from the Czech is somebody whose name is Lubos Rosa. And Lubos is a world champion. He's won, I believe, the gold medal. Just a phenomenal angler. And he developed this fly. And I don't want to say this is necessarily his, but it was kind of revealed to me in this book that Lubos wrote, and it's called Fly Fishing World. And this is a book that, it's tough to get your hands on in the United States. In fact, I want to say Franta sent me a copy of it. And I'm going through this book, and I remember seeing this fly that just was like, I don't know even how to describe it. Imagine like a blob of CDC. That's what it looked like. And it kind of drew my attention, but I looked at it, but I kind of forgot about it. One of those deals where I'm just, it was in my brain, but I wasn't quite sure about it yet. And it was in a section on lakes. So I said to myself, all right, maybe this is like, the blob or the fab or, the booby or one of those flies. So, fast forward now into this book, and I'm interviewing some of these anglers, and I'm interviewing people like that Noah Shapiro from the youth team, Ollie Bassett from New Zealand. I get to people like, Pete Erickson. I get to another person whose name is David Chlumsky, and all of them start talking about this fly, this Rekerka pattern. I'm like, all right, I heard it once and I wrote it down, and somebody didn't know the name, but I wrote kind of a description of it. And then, I get to Pete and David, and they're like, Lubos Rosa's Rekerka. And I'm like, what the heck is the Rekerka? And then I kind of put all the pieces together. I'm like, oh, it's this fly. I like run to my library, I find my book, and I see the fly, and I'm like, this is the fly. So wow. I immediately, contact Lubos. I'm like, all right, tell me about this fly. I need to know about this. I think this is going to be the one. And imagine this fly. It's tied with like red thread. You have a tail of a handful of crystal flash fibers sticking out, something like a flashy tail. Some people use floss and they change the color, maybe orange or pink or purple tails. And then you have nothing but CDC for the entire body. But it's not just like you're tying it in. You're taking your CDC, you're putting it into a CDC block. Then you're eventually cutting the fibers away from their stems. And then you put the fibers into a dubbing loop and you spin it. So you're kind of making a CDC hackle without the stems. And you get as many of them as possible. I mean, you really want to find super long CDC if you can. Some of these will take upwards of 12 to 15 CDC fibers to make one fly. So this is a fly like if you snag it in a tree, you want to climb the tree to get this one down. And I mean, you get to the end and you have this fly, and it just is like this blob of CDC, and the fibers are going all over the place. And I'm saying to them, all right, so I got this fly tied. Like, how do I fish this? And it's like there were so many different ways. I mean, most of them said they wanted it really, really dry. So, whenever I tie my dry flies, as soon as they come off the vise, I put them in some type of a pre-treatment. The brand that I kind of prefer is called High and Dry. They're actually just releasing this pre-treatment right now for fly tyers where you put the fly in it, you let it soak for, X amount of hours. I tend to let mine overnight. You dab it away with a paper towel, then they float like a cork for a while. So you want to keep this super dry, keep it dried off, put it in a desiccant while you're fishing it. You obviously can fish it, dead drift. You can fish it dry dropper, so you're fishing a nymph underneath it. But other things that I noticed with this fly, like Lubos was telling me, like he would cast it and he would strip it, almost like a streamer on the surface. And he would see fish that would chase it and they get really mad at the fly. But he would know like when they started chasing it and say, all right, now I know it started chasing it right there by that rock. That's where there's a fish. I'm going to give that fish a minute and then just make a cast and let it dead drift over it, and that fish is going to eat. And sure enough, it would. So, I found like there again, like different fishing techniques to entice fish to eat this fly.
Amazing. Yeah, Rose's Rock Urca. And I love the name. The name is awesome too, Rock Urca. This is so good. Nice, Tim. Well, I think we've nailed this one. I think 5 killer flies. I love the 5 flies we've chosen. And obviously, these are just 5 flies that are amazing, but your book is going to go into more detail. Anything else you want to shed light on before we get out of here? I know I want to talk Iceland. Maybe we'll have to talk about that again on the next one. But anything for you coming up other than the show season you want to give a shout out before we get out of here?
Sure. I mean, number one, yeah, for anyone listening, I hope, I get to connect with many of you at the fishing shows. I mean, again, I have a pretty tight schedule because my day job is as an elementary school teacher. So I don't get too many days off from my principal or superintendent to travel around the country talking fly fishing. But, without a doubt, like that's kind of number one is that will be kind of my winter. And then I tend to take off the spring, and I prefer to fish with my family as much as possible. This summer, I have a number of like super fun trips coming up. I'll be going to Iceland. I'm hosting a couple trips to Iceland. Looking forward to them. I think one is already sold out. One has some openings. I'll be going back to Alaska. I've been adding Alaska into kind of my hosted trips just because Alaska is so much fun. Yeah. And then, I'm kind of dabbling with a couple more locations. I was invited to another European country, so I might have a chance to fish out there and maybe go out west in the United States. We tend to fish for striped bass in the summertime and also go to the Outer Banks. So it's just, we tend to build the summer just around like fishing destinations and different species and hosting some trips to get out with, anglers as well.
That's perfect. And what on the Iceland trip? So you guys, did you have some Atlantic salmon action when you were up there?
Oh my gosh. We could have a whole podcast on that. Yeah. I mean, Atlantic salmon is, it's something that's newer for me. I remember, growing up and seeing those beautiful salmon flies. And I was like, that's not for me. Like I don't need to catch Atlantic salmon. It's just a fish, even though Lee Wolf considered them like, one of the greatest game fish of all time. I'm like, whatever. And, so I heard that Iceland was kind of known for them, and just for your listeners, I've been fishing in Iceland for a number of years. I tend to go there 2 or 3 times a season to fish. Love it. I've been hosting trips there because if somebody's going to fish in Wyoming, I don't think they need to go to Wyoming with me. I think they can figure it out. Yeah. But when you're going to a place like Iceland, the water's private, so if you get there and you're trying to book the day you get there, more than likely, they might tell you the river's really good, but it's probably not. Like the good spots they've been reserved for a year already. So, I heard about this one river in northern Iceland, the Myrkrist, and, I kind of heard that it was a little less of a nuisance for casting. So you could get away with fishing a single hand rod and 8-weight. And, I was like, all right, that's cool. Like, I don't want to be bringing people that have to bring a spey rod for Atlantic salmon. But I was like, all right, so you don't have to cast as far, but keep going. And they're like, well, the beauty is there's a lot of Atlantic salmon. And I was able to book the peak week. So whenever I say a lot, like, you fish 2 sessions a day. So you would fish a morning session and an evening session. And the expectation is that you're going to hook a fish every session you go out. So, I split the trip into, half of the trip is targeting Atlantic salmon. Then the other half of the time we're targeting trophy brown trout. So we tend to fish around 6 sessions for Atlantic salmon. And I think this year I landed 6 or 7 Atlantic salmon, like nearly one every session. And every angler that came on my trip this summer, in summer 2024, landed multiple Atlantic salmon, which is like unheard of. Like, for some destinations, you go there, Dave, and you like fish the whole week and you had a bump and you're like, oh, that bump was incredible. I can't wait till I come back next year. And it's like every time you go out, you get a bump in on this river in Iceland. So for any of the people out there that are either who are into Atlantic salmon fishing and want to have a little bit more experience with it, I would say check out Iceland, but also know like you have these trophy brown trout in your back pocket. Like the first time I fished this river up there, my first fish was a 20-inch brown trout. And I remember like I went to get my camera out and the guide is like, what are you doing, Tim? I'm like, I'm taking a picture. And he like laughs. He's like, but this is a small one. He's like, why do you want a picture? And I thought he was just joking around. And nope, he wasn't. Like that was one of the smallest fish of the week on that river. So it's one of those places where you go and, not every day is like that where you're catching, 24-inch brown trout, but you're fishing a river where every day you have an opportunity to catch multiple, mid-20 brown trouts.
That's so good. Nice. Well, we'll put some links in the show notes to your website, and then if people want to follow up with you on, definitely that trip availability. It sounds like you do have some openings there. That's awesome, and I'd love to follow up with you more on all this. But Tim, I appreciate you coming back on today and shedding some light on your new book and giving some nuggets here on some flies. Really appreciate that, and we'll definitely look forward to keeping in touch with you as we go.
All right. Well, thanks, David. As I love to say at the end of these podcasts with you especially, you are doing a ton of work for the fly fishing community. And I don't think anyone has any idea like what you're doing behind the scenes. So thanks for all the time and thanks for all this content you're giving all of us.
All right, quick CTA for you. Your call to action today is to check in with Tim and let him know you heard this podcast and you want to get that book. I've got it right here in my hand right now. As always, it's a great book. It's got some great photos, great history. Always love the history, the tips and tricks. He's got a little bit of it all going here. And we're going to be doing some more stuff with Tim this year. So stay tuned and check in on that. If you haven't already, check in with us on YouTube, wetflyswing.com/YouTube. We're going to be posting some more video content as we go. This might be some podcast episodes, and it might be some shorter stuff. But it'll be a good way to follow up. And we're also going to be posting some from Tim and our guests. What we're going to be doing is following up here, and we're going to be having some video content along with this podcast. So 2025, if it's 2025, well, I'm sure it's either 2025 or later. You're going to be seeing more of that out there. So please follow that. Click that subscribe button. That would be amazing. And before we get out here, just want to give you a heads up. Argentina, Golden Dorado. If you're interested in going down there, we're trying to figure out how many people want to do this trip. And if you can send me an email, dave@wetflyswing.com, I'll let you know on availability and what we have going there. We've got a big trip planned, so let me know if you're interested, and we'll go take it from there. All right, we got a lot to do tonight. Tonight, it's getting late. It's not super late yet, but if it's late in the night where you are, I'd love to hear from you. If you are in the Southeast, are you interested in streamers? We've got some stuff coming here. Let me know. We've got a new sneak peek on you, a new podcast series coming up here this year that you're going to hear about, and it's going to be focused on streamers. And so if you're interested in that, let me know. This is going to be pretty huge for us. I'm excited to share later this year, but I'm giving you a little sneak peek just because you've lasted all the way to the very end of this episode. Sneak peek, we got it coming here, and I'd love to hear what you think would be your favorite streamer content to share on this episode, on this podcast, anytime. All right, I'm going to leave it at that for the night. We're almost out of time here, so I hope you have a great evening. Hope you have a great morning or a fantastic afternoon wherever you are in the world, and I appreciate you for staying in all the way to the very end. We'll talk to you soon.